My name is Nimesh Wijewardane, and I am an intern at Nonviolence International. Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for attending. This event will be for 50 minutes and will be recorded and shared on NVI's website and YouTube channel. This isn't a normal webinar. We're using a meeting format so you can see and interact with each other. Please be respectful to all in your interactions. Today we will have 4 speakers in addition to myself. NVI Director Michael Beer will talk about his book, Civil Resistance Tactics in the 21st Century, and NVI's Tactics Database. And then I will introduce our brand new Tactics Study Guide. Then our incredible panelists will offer their remarks on Michael's book and the exciting universe of nonviolent tactics. Towards the end, we will have a Q&A session where you can post questions in the chat or raise your hand to speak during that time. And finally, we will have closing announcements. For those of you new to NVI, Nonviolence International is a backbone organization for the global nonviolent movement. We provide fiscal sponsorship and training, and we spread knowledge and transformative stories of dynamic, emerging nonviolent movements that give us hope in difficult times. In short, we are reshaping what we view as possible. Our first panelist speaking will be Michael Beer. Michael has been the director of Nonviolence International since 1998. He is a global activist for human rights, minority rights, and argues against war and casino capitalism. He has trained activists in several countries, including Myanmar, Kosovo, Tibet, and Indonesia. He is the author of Civil Resistance Tactics in the 21st Century, which you can download for free on our website. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you, everybody, for coming here today. It's great to have people who are really interested in nonviolent tactics and nonviolence here from around the world. I'm very honored to be here with these wonderful panel and speakers and experts on nonviolent tactics. And I think many of you in the audience here, and it's not really an audience, but this meeting are also experts. I look forward to learning and working with you going forward. This field of nonviolence has been a big part of my life. I've been here for 30 years at Nonviolence International, helping out movements around the world and teaching people about nonviolence. And it's an exciting universe. After 30 years, I pulled together a book to talk about nonviolent tactics. I hope it's useful. The nonviolent universe is a very exciting, vast universe of which we often have differences and controversies. And there's lots more to learn, and we're still in the infancy of learning about nonviolence. At Nonviolence International, we are firm believers in Dr. King's remark that humanity has a choice between nonviolence and non-existence. Almost every day and in every country, almost 200 countries, we have nonviolent tactics and action going on at just a vast, vast scale. We started collecting tactics many years ago and have now collected more than 350 of them into a public database. These were tactics that formerly Gene Sharp has called methods. We've preferred to call them tactics. I will share a screen briefly to say that we started to collect them into a database. We have 350 tactics that we've collected from around the world, building on Gene Sharp's work, and many of you have contributed ideas here. You can look at them in a gallery format. We actually have them in categories as well, and we divide these nonviolent tactics up into coercive kinds of tactics, persuasive kinds of tactics, and you can see that we also divide the tactics up into acts of expression, or what people say, acts of omission, what people don't do and refrain from doing, and then acts of commission, what people do, what people create and do. And you can open up these various, you want to see what coercive acts of commission can be, you can see some examples here. So it's you can also see the laundry list if you want to see the laundry list of 350 with their lots and lots of categories. So there are lots of ways to look at any kind of tactic. We're looking at human banners here. You can look up a human banner and see that this tactic is now used all over the world. It's been used a lot by the climate change movement. And if you scroll down, we will have actually examples that we've summarized, and then you can actually go to the original article. We want volunteers to help join us, to help make this possible and help contribute. And we need financial support. We've never raised money for this. We've done this just out of our own efforts, but we'd love financial support to make this Nonviolent Tactics database really grow. Obviously, I wrote a book based on these tactics, Civil Resistance of the 21st Century. I feel like it was enormously fun to do because the field of nonviolence is so exciting, and I would invite you all to read it. It's a free download, and we have it in Spanish and we have it in Farsi language as well. So with that, I will just want to thank Nimesh and Rand Engel, who helped write this study guide, and all the professors who are now using this in their classrooms and teachers. I'm love to come and speak to classes, particularly on Zoom, and am available to be of service to many of you. I hope today we can have a discussion about the dynamic field of nonviolent action and where we can talk about trends, talk about new things that are happening, and get input from you on how we can improve the effort to teach about nonviolence around the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Let's all applaud Michael silently for his work and his book and his comments. Now I want to briefly introduce our brand new tactics study guide, which we wrote to accompany Michael's book. Let me share my screen. Here you can see our study guide. I wrote it alongside Rand. I want to thank Rand for all his help. We have an introduction and a key takeaway section and 5 lesson plans for educators to use. This study guide can be used at the high school level or the college level. Educators can use all the lesson plans in the study guide or take a modular approach, selecting specific chapters. I wanted to talk briefly about the goals. I think one of the goals of the study guide and Michael's book and our tactics database is to expand the activist toolbox. There are so many tactics that people can use. I think our database has more than 300. So we want to really educate people and spread that knowledge of all the tactics that are available for them to use. We also, I think, want to expand people's conceptions of what nonviolence is, right? It's not just like marches or not just protests. Things like making a sculpture or spoken word poetry can be nonviolent tactics. And I think under Michael's typology, those are, saying or acts of expression. So you can see here, each chapter has learning objectives, activities, discussion questions. We have photos and videos. One of the core ideas students will encounter is the idea of that there are 3 levels of tactics, campaigns, and movements. You have the broader movement, working for goals. Movements plan specific campaigns, and in campaigns use specific tactics. So one of the classroom activities we have for students is to get them thinking, if I'm an activist in a movement trying to plan a campaign, which tactics would I use in a specific situation? And of course, this isn't just, theoretical. We're trying to reach high school students and college students, but young people are at the forefront of several important nonviolent movements happening around the world, right? The climate movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, the gun violence prevention movement, the BDS movement. Young people are leading these fights, and I think we really want to empower young people to be able to use nonviolent tactics in creative and strategic ways. And you can see we have lots of photos and links to YouTube videos. You can see here a photo of protesters participating in a die-in on the 2-year anniversary of the Pulse nightclub shooting. One of the most fun parts of writing the study guide for me was just including all these different examples of people engaging in civil resistance, die-ins, Colin Kaepernick kneeling for the national anthem, Gandhi going on hunger strikes, environmental activists breaking bank windows, even groups like PETA throwing blood on people wearing fur coats, the very controversial Freedom Convoy in Canada, which blocked roads in protest of vaccine mandates. There's so many interesting examples of nonviolent resistance happening all over the world, and this is just barely scratching the surface. So those are some of the issues that we try to engage in our study guide, and we want students to think about. And we hope this is a really useful resource for educators and for students. Now let's hear from the rest of our panelists. First, Amber French, who is the editorial advisor at ICNC. She runs their Minds of the Movement blog. She also launched ICNC Press, which published Michael's book. This semester, she was teaching at the Catholic University in Paris and had Michael as a guest speaker in her class. Amber, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Bonjour. I'm based in France. I'm based in Paris in France. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this conversation, and thank you everyone for showing up. This is a great turnout. As Nimesh mentioned, I work with the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict for the past 8 years, and I mainly manage the multi-author blog, Minds of the Movement. So as the managing editor of the blog, I work with activists, scholars, journalists, NGO practitioners, and more from around the world to hear, sort of amplify and channel their voices and amplify them. So these are people who are really delivering all of these different tactics that Michael talks about in his book. And so I first wanted to talk about how I relate to the book. Then I would like to talk a little bit about how I use the book in my classroom, university level. And then finally, just highlight one contribution that I think Michael's book makes to the field of study and practice of nonviolent conflict. So first of all, actually at ICNC, I used to run all of ICNC Press. So we launched ICNC Press in 2015, I believe. And at the time, Michael was working on his book manuscript, and I was the first editor at ICNC on the book manuscript. So many conversations, long conversations, trying to get all of this information organized. Such a monumental project, and I'd rather call it a project instead of a book, because that really, I think, shows that it's not the end. It's just a beginning. And I also, at the time, I thought Michael did just a really great job having a democratic approach and having a sort of crowdsourced approach to collecting all of the examples and all of the different types of nonviolent tactics. Not only that, but also drawing on many different people to sort of debate over how it needs to be organized. And I was very privileged to be part of many of these conversations. It was very enriching, and I think that one of the main takeaways that I have from the book and from that experience of editing an early manuscript was that this is a project and it's an ongoing project, and it will never end. And that's what's amazing. Americans, Turkish, Zimbabweans, people from all over the world, our creativity is endless. And so is this project, fortunately and unfortunately at the same time. But what I wanted to say is, first of all, many of you have heard ICNC's founding chair, Peter Ackerman, passed away last week. It was very sudden, it was very sad. And I wanted to acknowledge Peter Ackerman's support of the book, of the project from the very beginning. It's really his raison d'être, like we say in French, his purpose in life, was to develop a better understanding of how ordinary people nonviolently not only wage but also succeed in achieving justice and rights and freedom. And so in his memory, thank you, Peter Ackerman, of course, for supporting this work. And so I did make a contribution to the book. I'd like to highlight it. And also, Nimesh, will you give me a 1-minute warning so I stay on tack? I made a small contribution to the book. It's on page 25, documentary resistance. And this concept has been talked about before in Maciej Bartkowski's work. He's one of my colleagues at ICNC, and also the French historian Jacques Semelin that many of you may be familiar with. But I really put the term on it, documentary resistance, in 2017. And I describe it as efforts to document, preserve, and transmit information about ongoing nonviolent movements as an act of resistance. So this includes raw traces of movements, whether it's photos, videos, Instagram stories. There's so many different ways that we can document resistance. And there's also 2 types of groups who can document resistance. Activists themselves, they're constantly creating content. They're creating speeches, interviews, leaflets, posters, videos, but also historians and journalists or film directors. Anyone who writes and creates about films or writes articles about movements. So while I said that I'm not an activist myself, I have been to a couple of different marches and everything, but I am an activist of documentary resistance. That is my role, and that is where my strengths speak, is really to document the resistance that's going on in the world and amplifying it for the benefit of activists in the future. And so the underlying concept of documentary resistance is really defying repression. It can be defying movement repression, physical repression, violent repression, or censorship in historical narratives. And it's kind of like a wiki, for those of you who aren't familiar with the idea of a wiki, it's sort of a democratic encyclopedia where people are contributing knowledge, their own knowledge and their own experience as a sort of how-to instruction guide that's available for everyone. So that's really the change mechanism in documentary resistance. And I just recently interviewed a woman from Ukraine, Olga, who is a refugee here from Ukraine. She is a museum curator, and she is engaging in documentary resistance in the form of collecting items on a spreadsheet that are cultural heritage, monuments, and art collections in Ukraine that are being destroyed in Putin's war there. And lest we not forget, this is resistance because obviously Putin's regime does not want the world to know about these crimes. And as she said, she rightly stated in our interview, it is a war of culture. So culture should really be at the center of these conversations, of our conversations about how to resist aggression, Russian aggression in Ukraine, and how to put an end to the war. So I think that's one of the main, to bring this back to Michael's book, I think that's one of the many unique contributions that Michael makes to the field in his book, is that he expanded it beyond just black and white. We're talking about cultural resistance, we're talking about arts and resistance now. He brings a lot of color into the scene, I think, into the discussions about nonviolent tactics. And I think that this is important because it proves that our field is indeed complex and worthy of a deeper, sort of more interdisciplinary study. So to conclude, I want to talk a little bit about how I used his book in my class. I taught a class this past semester on nonviolence in politics at the Catholic Institute of Paris. I had 15 young men and women who were third-year pre-law students. They just knew that the class was going to be in English. It was an English class. That's what the main professor had to do in order to get it accepted as a class. It wasn't good enough for it to be about nonviolence. It's not proper social science in many academic circles in France. It's becoming more and more recognized, but we only got it across because it was going to fulfill a requirement in English. But many of them really got into the topic, and I think one of the reasons why is because we invited Michael to record a video presentation first so that the other classes there were many groups of students, and so that all of the different groups of students could watch the video presentation. And then with my students, we brainstormed some questions that we wanted to ask him, and we invited him on a Zoom call, just 30 minutes with Michael. And some of the questions that my students asked produced very surprising answers. It was a very lively discussion. For example, we asked him, "Are you an activist?" Well, I know that Michael Beer is an activist, but many of my students didn't know. And he said, "Well, I've engaged in over 1,000 nonviolent tactics in my lifetime, so I think so. I think I'm an activist." And hopefully in the question and answer, he'll share with us the anecdote about the limousine blocking tactic that was very successful. He shared that with us. And another question that really, was very surprising for the students, they wanted to know what his academic background was. They're students, they're just thinking about academia, university, applying to grad school, etc. And Michael Beer says, "Well, I have a degree in geology." And so the students were just laughing and very engaged and very surprised about our different conversations. And he said, from all of the work with this book, with the book on nonviolent tactics in the 21st century, I feel like I have an honorary PhD in activism. And I would agree with that. So to conclude, I would definitely recommend instructors, whether high school teachers, university instructors, grad school, any level, or even book group leaders, to invite Michael to speak. He's very flexible with format. Just let him know what you want, and he was very engaging. And I think he also just really made the information leap from the page because he was sharing anecdotes of his own engagement. And to conclude, so I would say that it was just such a monumental project. So I commend Michael Beer and Nonviolence International and all of the people who contributed to his book. I think everyone knew and agreed that Gene Sharp's methods needed to be updated, but Michael was the one who took matters into his own hands, and Peter Ackerman supported it and made it happen. And I think that, the project carries so much more value than just academic or semantic value, as much as I adore debating semantics as an editor. But seriously, how can we understand a complex phenomenon like nonviolent resistance without dissecting its methods to produce an anatomy of it? Beer's work contributes encyclopedic value, epistemological value, to the broader field of nonviolent resistance and better situates it within the field of social and human sciences. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Amber, for those great remarks. Silent applause for Amber. The idea of documentary resistance is so important, and thank you for your work in documentary resistance. Our next speaker is Rivera Sun, who I'm sure needs no introduction. She's the author of The Dandelion Insurrection, The Way Between, and other novels. She's the editor of Nonviolence News. Her study guide is on making change with nonviolent action, is used across the country. It was particularly helpful for us when we were crafting our study guide. Rivera, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nimesh. I'm really glad to hear that my attempts to explain this amazing phenomenon and field of nonviolent struggle to people who maybe had never heard of it before, maybe had just read a novel that they enjoyed, was helpful in crafting your real-world example. I was very excited to get to know your study guide a little bit. I'm already looking forward to downloading it and reading all through it. I especially appreciated right on the very first page that you shared the invitation to find tactics that you resonate with or like, and tactics that you question or find challenging. I think already today in the chat box, we've been having a very lively discussion about how to think about a certain tactic or a use of a tactic. And to me, this is an integral part of this project, is that when, Michael, you're not so much categorizing once and for all the tactics of nonviolent struggle into this, and this. You're saying, here's a way to look at it. Now engage with it. Engage your curiosity, your questioning, your knowledge and experience of how tactics show up in the world, and get interested, right? Because nonviolent struggle is the greatest thing that humanity has ever collectively produced. The single most greatest. I cannot think of anything that is more instrumental and liberatory and universally accessible than the tactics and tools and methods of nonviolent struggle. So I do a lot of trainings all over the country, mostly the US, occasionally international, maybe more so online now. And what I find is that when we're talking about tactics, tactics are tools, right? They're like a hammer, a saw, and a screwdriver. You can use them to build a house. You're probably going to use all of them to build a house, but they don't all work the same way. And if you're trying to hammer a nail with a saw, it's not going to work. And this is the single most common problem I find in activists, is that they don't quite get that there's differences between the tools and they're using the wrong one for the task that they're trying to achieve. So what I think your book and the digital tactics database and now the study guide really help people engage with is the craftsmanship of this work, that they can understand the physical nature of using a boycott like a hammer and understand that it's not appropriate to use a protest in that situation. You may pair them together to build a wall very successfully, or to unbuild a wall in certain cases, but you can't interchange them and expect the same results. So, paired with the understanding of to continue the metaphor, architecture and blueprints and design, it's invaluable what this tool and resource and instructions can really offer activists of any age, and especially the young ones who have so much fire and skin in the game for changing our world. I'll just finish and keep my remarks fairly brief today with saying that in editing nonviolence news, I find 30 to 50 stories of nonviolence in action each week, and I often return to your work to refresh my memory of all the tactics that are out there. I'll even take something unusual and do Google searches or any kind of search engine searches to see what's happening with these tactics right now. So knowing the breadth, depth, and height of the work that's going on helps us see nonviolence in action in our own lives. And I would say, in addition to the critically important step of just generally updating Gene Sharp's work, which is a little bit of a lion's task, right? Kudos to you for having the gumption to do it, because it needed to be done, especially for the digital age, from 1978 to 96. The world changed dramatically in terms of tech. And then from then on out, it was a whole different thing. We needed those tactics included. But you've also updated the stories that we tell about these tactics, right? So, and this is something I run into in classes and trainings with young people all the time, that it's great to talk about Gandhi, it's great to talk about King, but it is really different to start talking about BDS, to start talking about Black Lives Matter, to start talking about the climate change movements, whether it's the Fridays for the Future, Extinction Rebellion, to talk about the revolutions that are happening in Tunisia and Sudan and how they're trying to defend those revolutions, even not as opposed to talking about Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Serbia, Ukraine in the earlier wave of this, but in addition to talk about how current this work is. I find this invaluable in teaching and training. So my gratitude goes out to all of you for the work you've done and for the continued work. And I really highly encourage people to get Michael's book. I spent a lot of time sitting down and reading Gene Sharp's book on the tactics, page by page, to really grow my understanding of this field and its history. And I have spent not enough time, but certainly quite a bit of time with Michael's book and plan to spend more with it. So thank you. I will pass the mic over to my colleagues.
Thank you, Rivera. Silent applause for Rivera. I love the metaphor of tools and hammers. That's great. Our next speaker is Andrea Palomo-Robles. She is the executive director of the Satyagraha Institute. She's studied nonviolence at the Gujarat Vidyapith University, which was founded by Gandhi. Andrea, the floor is yours.
So I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, Nimesh and Michael and David for the invitation. I'm going to speak about three things, which are knowledge, then strategy, and then sustainability. Can we go to the next part of the presentation? Yeah, so what we see here is an example that I wanted to give of something I saw somewhere in the world. This was a protest from medicine students. They were protesting for the right to decide for what specialization they were going to take. The picture on the top, you can see that there are two different diagrams, was them. They were, gathered somewhere, not very well organized. It was not very clear who was the leader or, like the representative or what they were really asking for. Of course, they had an agenda, but it was just not very well structured. And when I was there, I was thinking, they could use some of these practical information that we have with Michael's book, because if they would have, just thought a bit more of how they could have a bigger impact. Also, this was in the context of the pandemic, just in the middle of the pandemic, and they were all gathered together very close, and that also doesn't give a very positive message if you're talking about medicine students, right? So if only they would have organized themselves better, and instead of being all together, very close together, they would have spread out, kept their distance, and they would have had a much more impactful picture to have on the media, for instance. So if they would have been organized in the way that you can see on the bottom, their impact would have been different. So with this, I just want to say that it is important to look at having organized and strategic action. Can we put away the slides, please? So what I want to talk first is about the knowledge part of things. And here I want to quote Michael, where he talks about why study civil resistance tactics. He says, studying tactics may inspire and promote action, deepen scholarly understanding, help recover nonviolent history, improve skills through education and training, and improve strategic planning. I think this is one of the most valuable things. We can, of course, promote the action, the concrete actions that are put there in the book. But from my perspective on what we do at the Data Institute is we want to train people to have the capacity to go out there and do their work in a better way. So in this sense, this reminds me a bit of what we do at the Data Institute. Our work is based on three main areas. So we have knowledge, which we think is a very important element for activists and for people who are doing the work, to just have all the information that they need. The second one is the skills, and here we include an arts part. So we want people who have knowledge and skills on conflict transformation, mediation, communication, dialogue, etc. And the last part is that we want to build a community. So I think we all know, all of those who are involved in the peace work, that it is that we can do a lot by ourselves, but when we are organized, we can do much more and much better. So that's what we want to do. And I remember here that one part of our knowledge information, when I first went to one of our programs in Mexico, was that we were studying, or we were discussing the Gene Sharp 198 methods. And that was very insightful for me. That was just great piece of information, and I still have those papers somewhere. And now I hope that we can use Michael's book in our curriculum. Also, we're having a similar webinar to these offered in Spanish in the near future. So that's also nice that we can promote these kind of resources for people who may need it. And I think the book is a very practical and concrete approach to nonviolence. So here, what do we want as activists? What do we want in our work? And I think it's impact. And we also want people to be equipped to make a change. So not just to go out there, with good intentions, which are great, but we also want people who have everything to make the best with their work. Second thing I want to talk about is the strategy part. Here, some of the things that most resonated with me when I was reading Michael's book were about innovation and creativity. I think we often forget about these elements. We can read in Michael's book and some references from Nadine Bloch, I hope I'm saying this right, and Erica Chenoweth, is that we, who also have created a fantastic collection of resources on nonviolence. In the last year, nonviolence has become less effective, which is, it's very sad, but why? And they explain that we are using repetitive tactics and we are choosing symbolic rather than instrumental and other factors. So maybe we can be more strategic. We could do our work in a more smart way. I don't know how to say this better. The last part is about sustainability. And here I want to talk about Gandhi, which is part of our inspiration at Satyagraha Institute. Gandhi is one of the first persons who proposed non-violent action in a more organized way in the modern history, let's say. And when he was doing his work 100 years ago, but it's still relevant, I believe, he proposed something called the constructive program. So this was like a set of elements that he considered important, not only to reach his goals, but also to have a sustainable, approach to his goals. So not only, okay, we reach this and let's see, but he wanted to have something that would allow them to continue with their goals in positive ways, in sensible ways for the people he was working with. So he created these. He thought, okay, let's include women who were not included in those times. Let's include young people. Let's think about our economy, society, etc. And I like to think about this as an example of what 100 years ago was a strategic plan. Now, this is a very common concept. But I think it's so important, and we forget about strategy very often. We think, okay, let's do something, but we don't think about what it means, who the actors are, what the consequences can be. All these elements that we need to consider in order to have an impactful result. So I want to invite you to think: how do we make sure our actions have a sustained long-term and continuous improvement of the conditions we want to change? That's a question for leaders. And to conclude, in Michael's book, he reminds us that civil resistance has been called people power. I like this very much when I read it. In different parts of his book, Michael talks about empowerment in different contexts. And I want to raise the question of how do we make sure, how do we make ourselves and others feel empowered and prepared or equipped to build peace? Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Silent applause for Andrea. We promised you a 50-minute webinar, and we are running short on time. So I will give some final announcements and we'll end the recording on time. But if our panelists don't mind, if people want to stay beyond 50 minutes and ask questions, we can have a Q&A session then. So I want to give a brief plug for the internship program. During my time as an intern at NVI, I've had so many incredible opportunities to interview remarkable activists for the Spotlight series on our YouTube channel, to be a part of webinars changing the conversation around Israel and Palestine, raising awareness about Western Sahara. I've I've gotten to talk to our founder, Mubarak Awad, about his relationships with Gene Sharp and Desmond Tutu. I've had some really great experiences. And if you are a young person or know any young people who are interested in nonviolence or civil resistance, we are accepting applications for our internship program. You can learn more on our website. Thank you all for joining us for this webinar in a time of looming climate catastrophe, rising authoritarianism, extreme wealth inequality, apartheid, brutal war crimes. Nonviolent action is desperately needed to build a more just world. And I want to quote the great Indian writer Arundhati Roy, who says, "Another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing." So thank you for coming to this webinar. The video will be posted on Friday on our YouTube channel. Please follow us on Facebook and Twitter and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And please join NVI, become a supporter, volunteer, donate, and help us build a better world. So let's all say goodbye together. Those who want to stay to ask questions can stay. Everyone unmute and say a quick goodbye. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.